Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what will be our second last webinar presented for 2020 by the Historical Trauma and Transformation Unit at Stellenbosch University. So my name is Malika Fourie. I'm a senior researcher at Historical Trauma and Transformation, and I will be chairing today's event. Special welcome to all our attendees, especially also our international attendees. Our events are always attended by people from all over the world, various countries in Africa today, also the UK, the United States, as well as Australia. And once again, we invite you to also say hi using the chat function in your screens. It's always nice for us to know who is joining us today. So we have a wonderful lineup today. We will be speaking to the authors of two recently published books, both engaging the central theme of the slow violence of poverty and structural racism, and how this has played out in the lives of individual men and women in South Africa. Both of these books chart very personal, intimate journeys, so we also thank the authors for sharing this with us today. So first up, we have Professor Malose Langa. Malose is Associate Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychology at Wits University, and he's also Associate Senior Researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Malose's research interests include youth at risk, trauma, violence, and the psychology of men. In his book, Becoming Men, Masculinities in a South African Township, he follows and documents the lives of 32 Black boys from the Alexandra Township over 12 years and the complexity of their journeys from boyhood and into manhood and masculinity. Then we have our own Lou-Marié from Stellenbosch University. So Lou-Marié is an NRF B2 rated scholar. She's also professor and chair in the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch. Lou-Marie's research focuses on the emotional worlds of low-income South African mothers, utilizing mainly psychoanalytic, feminist, and postmodern theoretical frameworks. Her book of Motherhood Melancholia, Notebook of a Psychoethnographer, is based on her clinical research and encounters over many, many years in the Dwarsrivier Valley, which is situated close to Stellenbosch. The book is based on narratives of the lived experiences of low-income mothers in post-apartheid South Africa. Then we are also joined today by Nomfundo Mogape. She will be our respondent. Nomfundo is well known to many of you. She's both a clinical psychologist and also the executive director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. So she is intimately familiar also with Malose's, Professor Malose's book and his work. And finally, we are joined today by our own Prof. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who will be facilitating the conversation between our panelists. So before I hand over to Pumla, I just want to also mention that you are welcome to post your questions during the presentations. You need not wait until the end. We would like to start seeing the questions already during the presentations, and then we will leave sufficient time also for a discussion from the floor at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Pumla. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malika. Dr. Fourie is a senior researcher in historical trauma and transformation, and will be chairing these webinars for the remainder of the year and into next year. So thank you very much for that inauguration of your chairing of these events. It's really such a pleasure to have all three of you this afternoon. And before I invite you to share with us your work, I just want to give the audience a sense of what the format of the conversation is going to be like. Professor Langa is going to speak first on his book, and Ms. Mogape is going to respond to Professor Langa. and after which Professor Kruger is going to speak on her work, and then the conversation among all four of us will begin. I want to tell you how much this is an honor for us to have you speak about your books. Our work in historical trauma and transformation is concerned about understanding experiences of violence among the younger generation, but experiences of this violence as they relate to our history. In other words, how the past matters and what the impact of the past in subsequent generations is. And both of your books deal with this topic. And so we are very privileged because for us to gain insights from people who have been in the field and spent as much time as you both have done in this work is a real privilege and capacity, giving us capacity to think through what the main themes of our work are. Now, Nomfundo Mukhapi, I have known her for the past maybe 20 years. And what has struck me about her work is also what she has done over a period of years, looking at violence and its transgenerational impacts and how it plays out over time in communities. She came up with a concept that she referred to, the smoke that calls, a powerful reflection on violence in our communities. So we thought that Nomfundo is the ideal person to have in this conversation. So for us, your books are, of course, the importance of your books is in its own, exists in its own right, but for us, it exists also in understanding the broader context of our society. You know, Malose speaking about men, young men in the community that he studied, and you, Lou-Marié, about women, especially the maternal aspects of womanhood within the context of the struggles for just a better quality of life and dealing with all the experiences that they face. And all of these, all of this is scholarship that is emerging from marginalized, understanding life in marginalized communities. So we cannot wait, and I'm sure the audience members here can't wait to have you speak about your work. So I'm going to invite you, Professor Langa, to kick off the conversation with your work. And if you could open your screen, please, so everyone can see you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Langa. Professor Langa seems to have disappeared from the screen. Can anyone tell us what's going on, Unison?
I'm checking now.
Please excuse us for a moment while we try to figure out what's going on. Thanks, Nomfundo. Nomfundo is trying to call him. This is a problem with technology. It's great to see how it works when everyone flashes on the screen, you know, comes up on the screen, their faces on the screen, but also we are also aware that sometimes we have these glitches. Something slips and then we lose the person from the screen. But we will see how we proceed. Let's just hear what Nomfundo says about where he is at. Okay, Lou-Marié, Lou-Marié, how do you feel about going first? Because now I think we have lost Professor Langa for a moment there. Hopefully he will come back on. How do you feel, Lou-Marié?
It doesn't matter to me if it doesn't matter to you.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
It's okay.
Welcome to all those fans of yours are here. We can see Pierre Duforce is here as well. So just to let you know that
Hello, Pierre.
all your fans are here. Okay. Go ahead. Thank you, Lou-Marié.
Okay. Thank you very much for asking me to join this panel, and it's a great honor to speak with Malose. I've read his book, and it's very impressive. I'm keen to hear what he's saying. I thought, seeing that I'm going first to speak to the topic that you've introduced, I want to read two quotes. One, coincidentally, from The Guardian on Sunday, in an article that Jacqueline Rose wrote. And the quote is this, and I think it speaks to our topic very beautifully. Modern day psychoanalysis talks of transgenerational haunting, the unconscious passage of historical trauma from one generation to the next. We bring our ancestors trailing behind us, which means that while we may die our own death, we also die on behalf of others who were there before us. And that's Jacqueline Rose on transgenerational haunting. I like that term of haunting very much. And that's the psychoanalytic angle. And then just to put it in context, the term slow violence is a term that Rob Nixon has coined. So I just want to read that definition also, so that we're all in the same place with that. We are accustomed to conceiving violence as immediate and explosive, erupting into instant concentrated visibility. But we need to revisit our assumptions and consider the relative invisibility of slow violence. I mean a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but instead incremental, whose calamitous repercussions are postponed for years or decades or centuries. And I think for both my work and Malose's work, those two concepts are incredibly relevant. And I hope that we can discuss that as we go on. Now, Pumla, you've told me that I have to say briefly what my book is about, and I realized it's probably the most difficult question that I've ever had to answer about the book, because of course I've kind of forgotten what the book is about. I haven't worked on it for, I haven't spoken about it for so long. But I thought I'll just tell you how it came about. That I started out with a very academic book about motherhood, a traditional, conventional book. The first title was Marginal Maternities, indeed, as you said, people on the margin. And the first version was was going to be just academic with footnotes and very conventional. But it was also based, the book in its first draft was based on a very, on a qualitative research project, quite traditional again, with interviews, based on interviews conducted by my students with mothers in different stages of motherhood, and in one specific community that I knew quite well. As I started analyzing the data and kind of and trying to begin to write up, I realized that in writing this up, I'm not only losing the women, I know nothing about them, and I'm also losing myself. It's not about me to write other people's interviews up. So I decided to go and work as a clinical psychologist 1 day a week in this valley, and thought that will give me a better place for a better feeling for the place and the people. So the final product of Motherhood Melancholia is then based on hundreds of interviews by students and me, years of ethnographic observation. I was in the book came out this year. I was in the Valley for 20 years, and countless clinical encounters with groups and individuals. So as I was as I was starting to write it up again, and of course in drips and drabs, and at times I got scared of the book and left it alone, and then I came back. But I started to realize that this is not really a book just about motherhood. I'm actually writing about poverty and the psychological experience of poverty and psychological responses to poverty, also those of me and my students. I realized I'm most interested in the very human endeavors of loving, eating, sleeping, family, parenting, working, everything that renders people vulnerable. And I hope the book in the end is about being human. Also, I want to make clear that I don't think that this is a book that tells the truth about the value. I don't think there is one truth about the value. This is not, it's more one specific take on one specific version of a series of encounters between middle-class psychologists with low-income people. So it really is a story of a thwarted engagement and complex relationships. It's not the truth about a person or a place. I do think a lot emerge about the people and the place, but it's one version. I also want to say here, and I think Malose's and my work really link very, very well. I come to the work as both a social scientist and a clinical psychologist. I'm interested in how individual biography is embedded in the social and the political world. So as a social scientist, I'm interested in structural violence or slow violence then. I'm interested in the psychological experience of people who live in poverty or are marginalized by racism, gender equality, often a noxious mix of all. As a clinical psychologist, I'm interested in how what is on the outside becomes the inside, and how the social and political world is internalized and imprinted on the minds of individuals and groups in very complex way. And this is where psychoanalysis, of course, come in. I struggle with the binary opposition of individual and society. I'm more interested in that murky place where the individual internalizes the political and the social, and where individuals construct the social. So that's kind of a little background to the book. The book is, I think, different from other academic books in that I've tried to tell my students often that theory is only useful if it helps us to eliminate and if it brings us closer to the material. And I find with academic writing, often it actually obscures and closes things up. So I've tried to make the book that the theory is more in the footnotes and that the stories of the women are in the main text. So I think that's a bit different. I hope that it makes the women's voices a bit more audible. Also, I have brought me and my students quite into the picture. I don't see it as a autoethnography, because that's not the focus, but I think we do need to declare ourselves and show where we're at. And as I said, I think the relationship is a very interesting one and an important one. But Pumla, I've spoken to you about this and I don't know if you want to change now. I don't know, is Malose here yet? Because what I did think is that to maybe make it more alive and to show you how the book works, that I'll read a small vignette from the book. A vignette. Is that fine? Is your time right for that?
Malose will come after you, yes.
Okay, is he back yet? Is he? Yeah.
Yes, I'm back for Kruger.
Okay, so Pumla, I'm going to read a small vignette. It's a vignette. It's a transcript really of psychotherapy sessions that two students in clinical training ran with a group of 13-year-old young women, really girls, very feisty young girls. And I hope that in the vignette, you will not only hear about real life physical violence, but you will also hear about slow violence, the slow violence of patriarchy and poverty and post-apartheid South Africa. Many other ideas very central in psychoanalysis also will become obvious here. I'm not going to list them now, but just to focus on how these girls who are really incredibly vulnerable and really face violence every day of their lives, how they defend against it in unconscious ways by either declaring war very boisterously or denying or retreating into a kind of a demure acquiescence. So I'm literally going to read from the book, if you don't mind. Pumla, stop me if it's too long. I won't go over my 15 minutes, but I don't think I will, but if you want to shorten it, please let me know. Okay, so the topic of the session is your dreams. And the girls are boisterous. They talk loudly, interrupting each other and underlining their words with gestures and movement. In the group, they ask what they see, as the biggest potential problem they will have to face in life. It's quite a job. But without hesitation, okie probleme, boy problems, says Sandra, without hesitation. He cheats on you with someone else, he beats you. My mother says, if a boy beats me like that one day, he will always beat me, and then I should leave him. Rudine is adamant that she will fight back. No, my auntie told me, if the boykie hits me, I should hit him back. My houe is in, my blows are in. Sandra is still convinced one has to leave, but I will still leave him, even though I give him a lekker good beating. Wildine agrees. I will first hit him and then I will leave him. Then he will know he won't mess with me again. Sandra can see it. She's visualizing it. Then his eyes are swollen. Wildine elaborates. I will throw boiling water at him. Sandra explains how she will do it. I will hit him with a pan. The young therapist becomes nervous. Sjoe jong, there's a lot of rage. Giseline says, ek sal vir hom warm knip met 'n tweezer. I will pinch him with a hot tweezer so that he burns. The student therapist, not very effective in bringing down the rage, asks the quiet girl what she will do. She will run away, Sandra quickly answers. The quiet girl, Jesami, answers slowly. I will burn him with a hot iron. Boiling water, a pan, a hot iron, tweezers, a different take on the concept of domestic violence. So the group goes on, and the group is 50 minutes long, and they talk only about violence. Remember, the topic is dreams. They talk only about violence. They talk about how their mothers stay in violent relationships, and they kind of theorize about why women stay, and they say things like, liefde maak hulle blind, or they're scared, they have big theories. They also talk about what their job is in these violent encounters. They also ask whose side should you be on and why one tends to take the mother's side. And they figure out it's probably because the mothers care. And that's why they take the mother's side, because they make it very clear that mothers and fathers are violent. Okay, so you can read the whole text if you're interested in that side of it. But as the session ends, it becomes the kind of mood changes a bit. It's clear that the violence in their households and the subsequent hurting and humiliation of their mothers disturb the teenage girls in the group session deeply. And they talk about how they literally try to block their ears and to put blankets over their heads so as not to hear the fighting. They now talk over each other. I can't make out who says what. I won't say anything. I'll put my earphones in my ears, and when they scowl, then I listen like that. O jene. I can't take it. Another one, when our people almost scowl in our house like that, then I'm busy with my phone, or I pull the blankets over my head and I cover my ears. I cry young that time. When I pull the blankets, then I'll now hear the one now beating the other, hear one of the kids crying, their clothes full of snot as they cry. Just say someone fights, another one says. My mom and my dad now fight. Now I just say I know and I hear them scowl. Then I switch the TV on very loud and then I watch TV. The girls are clear, however. that there are dangers in not being aware of what's going on. While you are here in another world, then your mom lies dead. So dissociation is not always good. The ensuing discussion about what can happen during a fight is heartbreaking. No, says Sandra, my dad won't go that far. Oh, yes, says another one, my dad will. A third one says, you don't know, your dad will. They will do it. If the mum makes the dad angry, dan sal hy daai ma doodslaan. Then he'll beat that mother to death. Sandra, the girl who is clear that her father won't kill her mother, makes a little speech. I always say one day I want a husband like my dad. He never beats my mum. And if they argue, they are okay again with each other later. And if they argue, I know he won't beat her because he's not like that. I want a husband like my dad. Not everyone is as lucky. One of the girls described her very violent father and how emotions sift during the violent fights. My dad, I don't want to call him dad. Almost everyone knows him. They know my dad is a strong man. If my mom and dad scowl, I get a little tear, a klein traantjie, and it's a bang traantjie. It's a scared little tear. Because when my dad starts with her, hy sal mens lewendig in die grond en doodklap. He will beat her to death into the ground while she's alive. And then I think, oh, Here, he's going to kill that woman. And it will make, and it will take like a whole army to get my dad calm again because he's too much on it, too much in it. She makes him very angry. And sometimes, dan kry ek ook lekker. It also gives me pleasure. Then I think, beat her, beat her, beat her. My cousin says my dad's hands must be chopped off if he beats my mom like that. I say, if he kills her, ek maak hom net daar frik. I'll kill him dead right there. You see the fluctuation of emotions. I will kill him dead right there. She's 13-year-old, school uniform adorned with a class captain badge. The mood in the group is somber now. The feistiness has been subdued. In the conversation, there's the clear wish not to hear and not to be exposed to the violent love they inadvertently have to witness. There's the profound ambivalence, the terrible fear that the caring mother will be murdered if there's no vigilance, the longing to protect the mother and to take away the power of the father. My pa se hande moet afgekap word. Always present, however, is the hate for the mother and the feelings of complicity with the murderer. Dan kry ook lekker, dan dink ek slaan haar, slaan haar, slaan haar. Then it also gives me pleasure. I think beat her, beat her, beat her. Sandra, the girl with the good father, the father who works hard in the sun, starts to collect the cups in which Coke was served. She puts the screw top on the almost empty bottle and tightens it, her lips pursed. This is a begrafenis hier. It's now like a funeral here, she says. The other girls giggle and put the remaining muffins in their jacket pockets. The therapists pack up the crayons and the dream sheets, throw out the empty Coke bottles and leave. The quiet girl's dream sheet lies on top of the pile in the back of the car. She dreams of becoming a lawyer. Her mother is a domestic worker. My biggest dream is that my mom and my mom's children live alone on an island in a big house. We must be rich. We must be a happy family. So that's just the end of the chapter on, ironically, the end of the chapter on love. Okay. I hope that gives you a taste.
Does give a taste. I mean, the taste of the raw narratives, the richness of these narratives. And before we get into this particular narrative that you have shared with us, I want you to share with us your vision for this book. I mean, I think it's important what you said when you started off, that you wanted to present work that is not purely just an academic work, because academic work, for all the reasons you stated before, that it doesn't give us this depth that we can see ourselves, we can witness for ourselves. The beginning of your book, I mean, you write, it's a literary work. It's a marvelous literary work. You know, the way that you start with Wendy's story and already signaling what you want to do in this book and your thoughts about why it is important for us to depart from this very cold and clinical way of doing academic work by giving these rich stories. Now, what I want you to share with us is, firstly, why the analytic lens? Why the psychoanalytic lens? Because I think by beginning at that point, we are going to come to the point about this particular story, what we're reading in this particular story through the psychoanalytic lens. But tell us first, why is it important? Was it important for you or for us to use a psychoanalytic lens?
Well, I think, you know, and this whole section, I discuss quite a few psychoanalytic issues like the mother-daughter relationship, the even the Oedipus complex, quite a few theoretical concepts that I think actually illuminate what's going on here. But broadly speaking, so I can go into that, but broadly speaking, I think what psychoanalysis helps us with when we are very, very aware of broader social and political processes, that every person doesn't experience it in the same way. That because you're poor doesn't mean that you just absorb poverty in a uniform way. People are hungry in different ways. They look for work in different ways. People experience violence in different ways. You can look at the little girls, very different kind of stories, even if there are some trends. So I think it helps us to think about the complexity of internalizing your social context, your political context, and that even if you live in a poor community and you are a child of apartheid, you still have a unique mother and father, or not both, but or a unique granny. You still have different things that you as an individual bring to the situation, and therefore, I think there's almost a classism and a racism when we assume that people who are poor don't have very complex psychologies, and I think this is what I want to show, and it very clearly emerged if you listen to the voices and you listen to them carefully, and you start bringing in theory, a very complex picture emerges. And I think Malose also does that very beautifully with his young men, that how the theoretical concepts are relevant. Sometimes not always. You can't just go and pluck it or put as if it will work, but sometimes it really helps us to illuminate things.
A complex picture indeed. But what strikes me about this particular story of a group of girls who are wearing school uniform, clearly from school, and having left home, and now the pictures that they paint about their home environments and the kinds of things that they're thinking about as 13-year-old girls. I mean, what goes on? What's happening here? This you started off by reminding us that these stories are located in the post-apartheid environment. Now, we are talking post-apartheid, and you and I and the audience, we know that these stories of violence and marginalization of communities, abuse of women and violence are stories that have been with us. And the question is, what is it that happens to a young person who wants to be safe in a loving home when what they witness on a daily basis or regularly is this act of violence? And in fact, as these kids are talking about it, you can see this occupies their minds. You're asking them about dreams. And it's just such a setup that when you ask about dreams, you think about the future, right? I mean, psychoanalytically speaking, you think about dreams, as in what did you dream last night, or what have your dreams been about? But you also thinking dreams metaphorically, what is your vision of the future? And there's always, the two, we always look at the two together. But when it seems as if, there's a paucity of just the capacity even to dream. I mean, when you think about Langston Hughes, statement of dream deferred, that here it's not even deferred, it's just not, there's just no space to even dream. And certainly from what you are describing about these young women, this is what is going on. There's just no, the space that they have is to worry, to trouble, you know, something troubling their minds, to be uncertain about the future, not to know whether they will find the mother dead, you know, at the entrance of their home. What kind of a life? I mean, when you think about youth, this generation and the future of our country, given that this is the young generation, and we know that this is not just this group of girls, it is pervasive in our country. How do we think about just these notions of, you know, the future and what life actually means on an everyday basis, if this is what you're exposed to?
Yeah, I think it's very hard, and it's very poignant, as you say, that we naively have this little dream sheet where they have to write what they want to become one day, and the minute they start talking, they talk about violence, and it's almost as if they're pointing out very deliberate, unconsciously, but in an almost deliberate way. What do you mean dream? You know what I'm dealing with when I go home. You know, what stupid shit is this? I mean, they're of course much too polite and nice to say that, but they then tell us these, and it's really horrible, the stories that they tell throughout the session. But you know, I think psychology is not taken seriously enough yet, because I think it's very naive to think that all the ugliness and horribleness of apartheid we can get rid of it in one generation. And I think this is why your topic is so important, because, you know, in other parts of this chapter, I discuss, for instance, Violent Man, and I'm trying to figure out one of the male clinicians interviewed him, and we're trying to find out what has happened to him that he is violent. And what we realize, and this has been theorized in the States, but if we and here also, that if you shame a person, if you don't give a person a dignified life, and you don't, and he's hungry and he's not respected at work, and his wife is always angry with him, and his mother beat him senselessly when he was a small child. This is what this boy, this man told us. You know, we asked him about violence, and he told us how he wet his pants when his bed when he was little. That's his connection to violence. Very interesting. And if we are not going to correct that, and I don't just want to say correct it, I want to say change it, that people don't live such shameful lives. I mean, I wish I could speak more about my chapter on hunger, because, you know, the mothers who can't feed their children are ashamed. And if people are ashamed, they feel less than human, and they become violent. And that is true all over the world. And I think there's not enough attention paid yet to human dignity and people treating people with respect, you know, and also specifically treating carers with respect, mothers and fathers, teachers, policemen. We're not going to stop that cycle of violence. I mean, these girls, they feel ashamed. I mean, they typically don't talk about violence at home, so they feel very safe in this group. But they don't talk about violence at school. They're ashamed about it. So they're ashamed. And you know what happens next, and you can hear how they resort to this declaration of war on men. You know, that's not going to stop anything. You know, so yeah.
You know, Lou-Marié, this is going to be my last comment and asking for your response to it. I like that story of a violent man, because it gives us a sense of, you know, it contextualizes. You know, the book is about women, but when you enter the realm of where, you know, what are their relationships, I really liked that. But what it also raised, a question that it raised for me, has to do perhaps not so much with the book, but the way that we have thought or taught in political conversations about shame, the kind of shame that dominates our conversations is the kind of racialized type of shame, the white gaze, as in the Fanonian kind of, trajectory of thinking about that kind of shame that Fanon talked about when he's gazed upon by this young boy who said, oh, look a kefa in our context, or look a nigger, and how that evokes shame. Now, that has been, I don't know what you think of this, but that seems to me to have been the motive around which shame is discussed, even within psychology, particularly in these current times of decolonial debates about decolonial thinking. And yet, what you're showing me, that story of this man, is a very important dynamic, that the circumstances into which this man is born and grows up are shaming. Now set aside the racial dynamic. In fact, most people in this context will encounter whiteness. I mean, by we, I mean people who are moving in professional circles, we are more likely to encounter whiteness, although people, who come from marginalized communities, they, as oppressed communities, they're working in environments where they are constantly oppressed by whiteness. But set that aside for a moment and think about the social conditions. This idea that this reality, that the circumstances under which people live, these marginalized conditions that have been passed on from the years of from the decades of apartheid into the current post-apartheid moment, how shaming that is. In fact, even more shaming, because that sense of social trust, we call it in our book, that's led by Kim Whale on post-conflict hauntings. In our book, we talk about that as the sense of betrayal. These are the stories through which we understand what betrayal means when society has no trust in their leaders. Now, if we begin to think, as you are telling us to do in the book, that here is a moment that represents the shaming that the social circumstances bestow on people's lives, and how it results in this hate, because they don't have the sense of worth. How can you bestow a sense of worth on others when you don't have that sense of worth? So the message from your book really is beyond, the call to do research differently, but it goes to policymakers, right? I mean, am I right to think about how you are urging us as researchers to surface these kinds of truths, and to find ways of speaking these truths to power?
Yeah, I think ways to restore people's dignity, because in the chapter on hunger, I firstly discuss the mothers of hungry children. They are ashamed. They are called bad mothers because in society, there's no more vile creature than a bad mother. That is, you can't be, and so they feel terrible. So they get angry and they get violent, but then the children themselves, there's also again the school groups that the therapists come after on a Monday, and they say to me the groups were impossible. They don't want to do it anymore because they couldn't control the kids. We found out that the soup kitchen wasn't present that day, and that the kids were hungry. We were so horrified. And of course, in our middle class minds, we didn't think of that as a solution. We thought, it's the first day after the break or whatever. They were hungry. And they didn't tell us. We found out because they were ashamed. They didn't want to say, I have no food. And in the one group, they started joking about it. And then they joked about what they'll eat when they get home. And of course, it's very highly likely that there wasn't food at home. So you know, there's shame on shame, and I think that that's why social programs are just, you know, as important. I think psychologists should speak about that, because you can't, you know, the external is always internalized, and so you can't feel good about yourself if everything on the outside looks horrible. I mean, people, you know, you'll see in every, there are so many, the kids manage to find good people, like a good father or a good teacher or a good Oma, or, you know, so it's interesting how they find good, as we will say, objects, but it's hard to be okay when you live a life of deprivation and you and you don't feel dignified and you don't feel human. You know, you feel less than human. So.
I think in a way, Malose, this is a good way of inviting Malose, Professor Langa, because it's also, you know, these stories of deprivation and how the struggle to become men in that environment, in those kinds of environments, speaks to the very issues that you have touched on. So Professor Langa, we will invite you at this moment to please share with us. Welcome again. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Gobodo Madigizela.
Thank you. Sorry, let me just say thank you to Lou-Marié. Thank you, Lou-Marié, very much. Okay, Professor Langa.
And also, I mean, to Professor Kruger, I mean, for the presentation. So obviously, I mean, given our time constraints, I'll just shoot straight into my presentation. I'll try and keep it brief. And obviously, I mean, the title of my book, as read, is Becoming Men, Masculinities in a South African context. And I want to give a quick background information how the book came about. Obviously, my work started while I was working as an intern psychologist at CSVR, where Nomfundo is the executive director. And I was working at one of the correctional centers in Gauteng, popularly known as prisons. And obviously, as a young black man, I must say I remember my first day at this correctional center very well. That I was highly traumatized and shocked and terrified to see, of course, so many young black men who many were the same age as me. And obviously, my work in this correctional center entailed running groups and working with this young men as part of their rehabilitation. But I must be honest that I always had this fear. And I was working with a colleague, the late Witumelo Kekana, who was a social worker, and he used to tease me that every time when we were about to, I always had this fear of being locked up mistakenly and being forgotten in the prison, sort of cells. And every time when it's 1 o'clock, I'll get into a panic to say, Chief, we definitely need to leave. And what if the warders forget that we are in here, and then they lock us in, and off they go. And I must say I did cope with it. But obviously then I started asking myself a lot of questions, because I was troubled, to say, is there a way in which young black men can be different? Because in talking to them, in facilitating all these groups, all of them spoke about growing up in homes which were characterized by abuse, violence, neglect, deprivation, lack of father figures, gangsterism, and peer pressure, and so on and so forth. And obviously, I mean, the stories were all the same, from one inmate to the next. And I think that is where my research sort of passion began, by asking how is there a way in which young black men can grow up in deprived black communities and embrace voices of masculinities that are non-violent and pro-equity and pro transformation. And like Professor Kruger, obviously then I used psychoanalysis, but obviously psychosocially, relying on the work of Stephen Frosch, to say psychoanalysis outside of the clinic. And I must say, when I look back, having used a psychodynamic sort of theory in trying to make sense of my interviews with this young men, there are a lot of themes that came to the fore. That often when we talk about young Black men, what we see the bravado, we see the violent behaviors, we see the aggression, we see all kinds of risk taking behaviors. But in fact, there's a lot that happens when you begin to go beyond the facade of being a male person. And I'm going to pick up a few things which overlap with Professor Kruger presentation. The whole notion of the boyhood code, I guess, based on William Pollack sort of work. That basically what you see when you talk to this young man is that the whole notion of trying to be, inverted commas, like a real man, they become dehumanized. And I say the whole process, it kills their being, and obviously they become dead living zones. And obviously when they're dead living zones, we still expect them to be human and relate in a humanely sort of men. But also the theme of shame. Interestingly, as I was listening to Professor Kruger, it is as if we're sharing norms, because shame was an important theme. Shame in terms of not knowing who your father is, and some narrate all kinds of stories of school meetings where the school principal would say, where's your father? And the boy would make up a story. My father is working at night. He's working night shift, he's sleeping. And for the whole entire high school, there'll always be a story about a father who's working night shift. And all of them knowing very well that their fathers were not present in their lives. And even when they were playing with their peers, some had fathers, and there will be this, then they'll make up a father, to say, because there was this thing of the shame associated with not knowing my father. But also, I mean, if I take it further, the whole theme of shame was around, obviously when they were young, they began asking themselves, if I do not know my father, what does it mean about my mother? And does it mean, because some went far as asking their mothers, and some were quite uncomfortable having a conversation with their mothers about who their fathers were. And also the shame of not having a girlfriend. I mean, it was an important sort of theme. It was rendered compulsory that you need to have a girlfriend, and of course, if you don't have one, you get called all kinds of names. The shame of not having certain clothes, and especially the ones that are branded. You needed to have an All-Star, you needed to have a Cavella, you needed to have a DMM, T-shirt, Supeka. And if you did not have some of those items, you couldn't belong to a certain sort of group. But also the envy was an important theme that was sort of put to the fore. And the whole theme around humiliation, because other boys were trying very hard, to be different, to say, obviously, I with a lot of imagination of wanting to live a different sort of life. But obviously then you get humiliated to say, you are simply a teacher's pet. Hence you're always carrying your books. And with your books, you're not going to go sort of anywhere. But again, when young Black men are being spoken about, let's get said about their feelings and emotions. So obviously when you read all this material, even fear, we see them as fearlessness. But in fact, they're all so fearful. And there was a big thing around the fear of being killed. So obviously, when you read the book, it is not fiction that they have this fear of being like killed. Opa in the book, once upon a time, he identified himself as the firstborn. And obviously he works very hard after his girlfriend sort of like fell pregnant. And he says, look, I need to man up. And manning up, it means I need to go and find a job. And he finds a job, he begins to work. And obviously in between, he's still going to school. On his way back from work, this part-time work, he gets shot and he dies. One of the boys in the group, I mean, his brother gets shot. I mean, he dies. So obviously this fear of like dying, it is real and it does sort of like happen. And then the big theme like around like, ambivalences and hesitations, where what you see, where other boys are trying to embrace like alternative ways of being young Black men in this violent-ridden sort of like community. But for them to survive this like space, they need to be in the borderland, where they're able to vacillate multiple worlds, of being in this world and being in this world and being in this world. But obviously it comes at a cost, sort of like emotional, where they talk about how this process of being in multiple worlds, it is tiring and it is exhausting, and it further dehumanizes like them, to say, I feel so sad, I feel so depressed, and I wish I can just be like myself and be so free of this burden of needing to prove that you are a boy from Ekasi. And a boy from Ekasi needs to behave in this way, needs to relate in this way, and this is how he needs to be seen. But again, when you look back to the methodology of using disposable like cameras, of say, here the disposable like cameras, and the instruction was very simple. What does it mean to be a boy in a new like South Africa? And that was it. So obviously, I mean, these boys went, I mean, I remember I said, I'm giving a week. And after a week, some of the boys came back to say, look, the week is not enough. Can you give me a month? Because there's this particular house that I want to take a picture of. And when you read in the book, you see some of the pictures. So obviously, psychoanalytically, there's a lot that can be said about, I mean, Professor Kruger was talking about dreams, that some of them were saying, this is my dream house. They had a lot of fantasies. And obviously, I mean, it's around these inequalities, because we all know Alexandra and its closeness to like Sante and the politics like surrounding that. So I guess the conclusion that I reach out of all these like stories of them talking about their absent like fathers and the need for them to be different like fathers, the need for them to be different boyfriends, the need for them to achieve their careers. And what helped in this like project is that I was able to trace these boys over a period of like 12 years. So now I can stand here to say many of them, though I met them when they were 12, 13, 14, some were able to achieve some of those like dreams, despite all kinds of like difficulties. And upon their reflections now as a young man who are in their early like 30s, they refer back to a multiple sort of like conversations. To say those like conversations, which is what I conclude, to say basically what we need to create is to create like safe space within communities. Safe spaces for young girls to, I guess, reflect based on Professor Kruger's presentation, for mothers to have safe spaces to reflect about all these intricacies of what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a father, but also what it means to be a young man. So basically is that we need healing, to deal with our history and how our history gets reenacted in the present like moment. And I guess that would be like my conclusion, to say we need healing, and healing needs to sort of like happen in like community.
Thank you so much, Professor Langa, for that real elucidation of what your work is about, and much more than your work, we can't wait to have Nomfundo Mukhapi respond with her own comments. So I think without much further ado, let me just hand over the virtual mic to Nomfundo. Nomfundo, please open your microphone. Thank you. Thanks, Professor Langa.
Thank you, Prof. Hi, everyone. Yeah, technology is just like that. I was on my laptop with my video and it just decided to disconnect. So I've just connected with my phone, which unfortunately means I can't turn my video on. The minute I can connect with my laptop, I will do that. But thank you very much. I think all the presentation have really been rich. So to just highlight that the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation is an organization where we have been working with issues of violent prevention and trauma for the past 30 years. And I started working there similar to Malose as an intern clinical psychologist. For me, the turning point really came in 2008 when we experienced the violent xenophobic attacks in our country, and they were happening at a collective level. And when we went back to the office, media and others called us because we are an organization that was working with issues of violence. We also had a trauma clinic. So there was, of course, an expectation that we could take our knowledge of trauma and translate it into how you address larger societal issues and violence issues. And I got stuck because the training that I had received at varsity did not equip me. And my knowledge of that, I call it in inverted commas, traditional trauma theory, was not sufficient in helping me to explain the phenomena that I was seeing in front of me. That is when I started the venture into understanding what initially I called collective trauma. I know, Prof, there's a lot of discussions around what we name these things and what the naming is. But I've started using the concept of woundedness because when we went to communities and we asked them to tell us how they define trauma, they called it inxeba lenhliziyo, which is the wound of the heart. And you'll hear when I talk later around why the issues of naming and the words that we use are so important. So I've really used this work and this knowledge in beginning to then understand how we deal with various issues in our society, including violence, including poverty. And I therefore wrote a chapter in The Smoke That Calls, which Prof. Malose Langa was the main researcher, and I talked about collective trauma. So I'm just gonna talk, Prof, about, initially the issues that have emerged for me over the years as I was doing this work that I think are relevant for this discussion. And then I'm just going to then go and look specifically on some of the issues that Prof. Langa and also Prof. Kruger had also raised. But I just want to highlight 3 issues. The first one is just an appreciation, and already Prof. Malose's sharing and some of the narratives that Prof. Kruger has given us points to this, just how deeply wounded we are as a society. Right, and this woundedness is at a collective level, transgenerational level, but it is embedded in our institutions. And it's what I like what you call it, Prof, is the transfer of the marginalization narrative. But I think for me, the biggest issue in our society is not just that we are wounded, is how asleep we are to this wound. And there's a big work that needs to be done. Those of us who, the more I started working with these collective processes, such as collective violence, and as an executive director at CSVR, I've engaged with a lot of policymakers, programmers. I'm just amazed at how the people that are supposed to help our country deal with its social ills don't see the trauma. But as somebody who's trained in trauma, I can see it everywhere. So that is the first issue, I think, the challenge that we have as people that are working in this field. How do we bring this awareness? The second one, which is an area that I'm really interested in that is emerging for me, and you talked a bit about it, Prof, when you were talking about this concept of betrayal and being failed by leaders, is the role of leadership and how contexts like ours that have got this deep-seated woundedness can actually produce trauma carriers, leaders who are wounded themselves, whether it is in a family environment or in institutions that then perpetuate this woundedness, or leaders who have worked on themselves, so the who are peace carriers. So the whole issue of leadership in wounded context is really, really critical when we're looking at issues of policy and programming. Because I've seen a lot of people engaged in violence prevention work, even Prof. Malose, some of the work in correctional service, and the level of trauma that the people that are supposed to implement these programs carry, and how they then perpetuate the very same problems. And the last one that I just want to touch on is what I call, actually this I borrowed from Miss N from the UN when she was talking about violence against women, and said that in a society, you know, we have a paradox that the more we invest in GBV, the more it seems to increase. And I really think for me that this is our next work, is addressing this paradox that our society is facing around violence prevention, around development, and a lot of things. The fact that we continue to invest in schooling, in a lot of these things, and you can't fail our government for doing this. But the paradox is that the more we do this, the more violent we become. And my argument, and I think Prof. Kruger also touched into this, my argument is the reason for this is because there is this neglect of doing trauma work and woundedness work in a society. And there is lack of appreciation of how this woundedness work shapes or interferes with the success of these interventions. And therefore the work for us, whether it is to work with poverty, with these mothers that Prof. Kruger has talked about, with these boys that Prof. Malose, the men and the boys that Prof. Malose have talked about, our biggest work is to intervene in this paradox. And it is us, the people that are doing this work, it is the scholars, it is the practitioners that are doing this work on trauma, who need to take our work and translate it in ways that can make a difference in a society. Because the neglect of this trauma, the lack of appreciation of how pervasive it is and how it affects all areas of our sector, and the lack of appreciation of therefore the kinds of investment that needs to happen in order to do this work is really, really a challenge. So Prof, if you can allow me just in the next 2 minutes to look at examples. So for me, then the question is, if we were to use this lens of woundedness and understanding wounding, how will then it shape the way in which we intervene? For example, if we were to use some of the learnings that Prof. Kruger has brought in, how will it change the way we deal with poverty? Because our work has shown that poverty, Prof. Kruger talks, I like what she says. She says her work is about seeing how the external is internalized. And my work is about how the internalized is expressing the interaction with the external. So, for example, for people who have experienced deep wounding in our society and they were excluded in relation to poverty, poverty is not just about poverty, it's about re-experiencing the trauma of the past. And it is intergenerational and it's collective and it's transgenerational. So when we do poverty work, it's also about undoing the trauma work. So it shifts the way in which we see the work related to poverty. When we're doing in violence prevention, if we were to integrate this work that the professors have so eloquently talked about, understanding issues of shame, issues of envy, issues of fear, in beginning to shift how we do violence prevention, will that shape the way in which we do our work? So I think the issues for me that I would like to just point here as we are talking, Prof, is that first of all, how do we translate our work as the people that are working in the field in a way that will inform policies, programming, and practice? I'm coming back to the issue of language again. How do we use the language? How do we take this amazing research that has been done by the two professors into a language that can be understood by the policymakers? I don't know whether it is us who will do that work or we need translators in this field who understands both the policy work, but also can take our work and translate it. And finally, which has always been my passion, and I'm glad I've got professors here from university, and I go back to my story. I was trained, in one of the universities that I thought of as being really good universities in our country. But there I was, a trained clinical psychologist, And I was asked to explain the xenophobic violence, and I couldn't. So there's a big question on how do we shift our curriculum so that it helps us as practitioners to operate in wounded contexts, not just in doing one-on-one work. How do we shift our curriculum so we can really influence these larger collective processes? Because Africa is in trouble, South Africa is in trouble, and I really think that we are the ones that can speak to that paradox by bringing our work into these processes. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you so very much, Nomfundo. You know, all of these ideas that you are presenting to us, the challenges actually, they're not just ideas, they're challenges. I mean, I love the expression that you conveyed earlier on in your talk, to intervene in the paradox and the challenge of rethinking our approaches. There's so much that I'd like to engage with you, but I'm also watching the time, and I want the audience to raise their own provocations or questions to the speakers. But I just want to say very quickly that part of what you're suggesting that you do is happening at a very small scale. And because our unit is named for for this work, we are very fortunate because there's already a group of young people who are beginning to ask these questions. One that comes to mind and that relates specifically to this work is Lerato Machetela, who as a young clinician, clinical psychologist, asked the very questions. I mean, it's amazing to me that you asked the same questions that she asked when she qualified, probably, you know, several years after you qualified, and that led her to doing research differently in a remote area of the Free State on young people, very similar to the young people that Malose is the young men that Malose is writing about. So they are beginnings of this response, you know, of a response to your challenge. We have, in fact, we had here on this webinar a question from someone who is in Rwanda, who says, thank you for this conversation to Lou-Marié and to Malose, because they are facing, as Rwandans, they're facing challenges the exact challenges that Nomfundo has raised with us. I want to pass the virtual mic now to Melike so that she can manage the Q&A with the audience. And to say, perhaps in ending on my side, I'm going to disappear and leave this to Melike, to say that we really would like to have you back, you know, all three of you, because this is a conversation that we must have and not have a time limit, perhaps over 2 days. It's such an important conversation for the state of the nation, as well as Nomfundo says, the state of the continent. So I would like to pass this on to you now, Melike, and thank you very, very much. And thank you, Melike, for taking over. Thanks.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you very much to all the panelists for these very rich, vivid, and almost visceral snippets from your books, and for sharing that with us today. So we have about 15 minutes left, but we want to engage with some of the questions that the audience posted. So I thought of, because quite a few questions centered on this idea of repair, or what do we do? I want to maybe start there as you know, framing the questions broadly to both Professor Langa and Prof. Kruger. So Lizanne asked, how can the field of psychology help us to stop the generational cycles of violence and poverty? And linked to that is this question by Emmanuel that Pumla already referred to from Rwanda. He's talking about the genocide, saying the tragedy has affected millions of people. He says nowadays the young people are facing the impacts of this harmful event, and some of their parents are facing the impact of this event. I've recently interviewed parents and indicated that they provide poor parenting since the child-parent interactions remain poor. Which recommendations or interventions can you recommend to us so that the transgenerational legacies should be reduced? preparing a good, better future for the children. So maybe the panelists could just kick up with those two broad ideas, what is the place of psychology and what can we also do as parents in our own homes? I'm not sure if I should maybe say who should go.
May I ask you to come up live, all the speakers, so that the audience can see who they are talking to, please, if you can, as much as possible. Thank you very much, Nomfundo, and Professor Kruger, if you can.
Malose, would you like to start?
Hi, Dr. Fori. Sorry, I lost a bit. Do you mind to repeat the last part of the question? I hate when you're busy.
So the question is, there was a question by Sarah on how the field of psychology can help us to stop the generational cycles of violence and poverty. And with that, I might add, what is the role of us as researchers? How do we ethically engage in this kind of research? I know Lou-Marié talks about how she revisits her communities and actively engages with them. And then maybe also linked to this notion of what can we do is this question by Emmanuel from Rwanda. What recommendations or interventions can you recommend to us so that the transgenerational legacy should be reduced also for future generations?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think Nomfundo with a personal example and the comments made by Professor Gobodo-Madikizela, I mean, are quite relevant to this conversation. I've always sort of argued that the profession of psychology has to occupy its rightful sort of place in a sense that we have so many answers to the difficulties that we are faced with. But obviously, I guess at this point in time, I mean, even in terms of BGBV, xenophobic violence that Nomfundo spoke about, issues of fatherhood, motherhood, the issues of hate crime. When I read the work that we do from colleagues in different universities, I'm of the view to say, if then we're to share, which this forum, I guess, helps us in propagating that our messages, we can begin to then say, look, psychology has so much to sort of offer. Because I did go back to some of the comments where it's like we're going back to the basics. The basics of saying, look, I know a lot has been written about psychoanalysis and its limitations. But obviously in my work, and I guess maybe Professor Kruger will come in and many other colleagues, is that of course, yes, we admit some of the criticism that have been leveled against this theory. But again, if you have an awareness of social factors, political factors, you are able to use psychoanalytic theory and many other psychological theories to explain the unique difficulties that we are faced with. But at the end of the day, we need to start simplifying our messages to the bigger audience, and then we are able to also go to communities where we are able to have a bigger sort of influence. So for me, in brief, is that look, a lot has been done, within universities, and how then do we turn our work for the benefit of our communities?
Thank you very much, Professor Langa. Lou-Marié, would you also like to respond?
Well, I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with Nomfundo and Malose, because I just think it just shows what good work is being done by psychologists. And there are many people out there doing that kind of work. I think our problem is that we are very good with our interventions, but we don't communicate with policymakers, and we don't communicate with training programs, because it's, I think our interventions are very important. I think we should go on with it. I think working on the ground also keeps us alive. I mean, as I said, I stopped. I decided not to write an academic book because I felt distant from my material, and I think we need to bring our work to people. Franz Kafka, I think, said a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. Now, if what you write is not connected, if you're not connected to what you're writing, why will a policymaker be? Why will a training program be? So I think our challenge is, there is such good work that I see that people do in communities, but it's not communicated to policymakers, and there seems to be a break between policymakers look at large epidemiological studies, but they don't pay attention to the more complex issues. You know, like something simple like giving children mentors, giving things that seem quite simple, but that as psychologists can say it works. For a boy to have a mentor or for a girl to have a mentor, it works. So, but somehow we sit in our clinics and in our communities and we don't communicate. And I think when we write academic language, and that doesn't reach the public and it doesn't reach policymakers. So I think the policymakers should look at us, but I think it's our challenge to open up our work, especially as practicing psychologists. And then in terms of training, I think there's a problem with training. I think every training program should have a huge community segment. They don't have any more clinical training programs. So I think so that is something. I think we need to train more people. We need to train counselors. We can't only train clinical psychologists. We need more people out in work, because then I want to get to interventions. So it's policy, training, and interventions. Interventions do work. I mean, there are, the case studies I can bring to see the impact of our interventions, but there need to be more of it. And the training programs, and I think Malose, that's what you referred to, we can't do psychoanalysis, we can't do 1-year therapies, sometimes we have one session with a person gets one session of work. We need to adapt our theory to be able to fit into that, first thing. And the second thing is we need more people in the field, and we need to be recognized. Every clinic should have psychologists, not only people who get one class. There should be psychologists at clinics. So those three things, I think, and I think we have a very, very crucial role to play. And I know people do important work, but somehow I think we're not good in marketing what we do. I hate the word marketing, but.
Wonderful. Lou-Marié, thank you so much for those very tangible, very reassuring and positive pointers that I think many of us can take to heart. I think you should publish a paper on what you just, on how you responded to that. Also Prof. Langa's comments. So I want to just in the last few minutes turn to a few more questions. So Tendai asked Prof. Langa, I understand that you are well versed in psychoanalysis. On your personal opinion, what do you think are the prevailing themes around young Black men to perpetrate rape or sexual violence? Lou-Marié, I'm gonna go to your question as well while Malose Prof. Langa is coming online. A question from Ashraf, also from the psychology department. To what extent did the concept of coloredness as an apartheid category emerge in your work? Is this an identity that is embraced in the Dwarsrivier Valley? How can we deal with identity politics in the context of widespread poverty and inequality in our country and on our continent? In other words, is there room for a shared sense of Africanness that we can aspire to? So two difficult questions. I'm going to ask Professor Langa to respond first to Tendai's question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot has been written on the issue of, I guess, like, sexual violence that young Black men, perpetrate, and I guess, I mean, the lot of themes that come to the fore, themes around power, control, domination, and submission. And obviously, in general, the perpetrators, draw on all kinds of discourses. The discourses of what it means to be a male person, and then the expectations that is expected of young women, and obviously, when you look at this, it goes back to our conversation to say the lot of messages that we need to start debunking at a very young age about when you listen to young men talking about the I guess sexual sort of desires. It is as if women do not have sexual desires. When they talk about the need for them to have multiple partners, the same privilege is not expected of young women. And when young women exercise their own agency, they get subjected to all kinds of abuses. And I'm of the view to say, again, going back to what we kept on saying, to say we need to have conversations in communities to challenge, I guess, some of these messages.
Thank you very much, Professor Langa. Professor Kruger, we have 1.5 minutes left. If you would quickly like to respond to Ashraf's question.
I want to, but I just want to say something about Malose's reply here. What I was very struck with in his book is the implicit power of women and girls. And that's what I also get in my work. There is power, but it's not power that's recognized. The sexual power of girls, for instance, Malose, in your book, that a girl can decide whether a man is a good or a bad lover, and that they can crush that, and the very moving man who says, my mother, Simon, who's in jail, and he says, my mother still lives in my head. She speaks to me every day, So women are not powerless, and I think we need to find a way of acknowledging that power. Even these girls, these feisty girls who can tell you how they will get rid of the men with household. I mean, it sounds terrible, but at least they're angry, and anger is a powerful thing, and we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize women's power. This Ashraf, hello Ashraf. I want to answer this question. Is there 1 minute to say something?
If you can go ahead.
There's not a simple answer, Ashraf. I as Pumla pointed out, we are very aware of how white people are shamed about apartheid and how Black people have been shamed by apartheid continuously. That can never go off the agenda. It is always there. How it interacts with poverty, with class, I think psychologists have been bad at. We're not paying enough attention to class, and we should think about how that intersects with race. So it's very hard. The race thing is very hard, and it was something very difficult to get around in terms of my book, to talk to people about race. But it did come up in various ways, and people are still very aware of it. And I was still struck how we are bound to the apartheid categories. And part of it has to do with how we are, the process of transformation and how we'll do right to those who have been disadvantaged. But part of it is also in people's head. In the valley, people are very aware of race. And it's not, we can't say, somehow we're stuck to these 4 horrible categories. And it's fine if it's used for transformation, but there are still problems there, huge problems. Sorry, Melika, I've gone over time, I think.
No, thank you very much, Lou-Marié. I thought maybe just to give Nomfundo a last opportunity if she wanted to also respond to any of these questions before we finish off. Nomfundo?
No, thank you. I just wanted to respond to the question that was talking about what is the work and the role that psychology can actually be able to play in making a difference. And it's just to emphasize what the professors have said. I think we need translators. Maybe it is not us who should necessarily be the ones who take the information and translate it. I think we have to seriously look at partnerships within psychology, people who are really good at taking this great knowledge that we are doing, that we are producing and translating it for policymakers. Lots of organizations that are doing advocacy work. The other thing that I've really been pushing and I've been asking for the longest time, saying, who is the advisors to our programmers and our policymakers and our leaders? Do any of them have people with the psychological knowledge who advise them on how to do the work? I think we have to really advocate for this. Other countries have psychological advisors who help the policymakers to do this work. And maybe some of us need to be put in those positions, because if you are in a wounded context, you need to have those. And I want to just finally talk about the question that was raised on how you work on issues of transgenerational trauma. And I just want to say, for me, 2 things. I definitely think the issue of leadership is critical. We really have to start doing that. But the other one is the issue of institutional transformation. How do we use our trauma knowledge? I am amazed at the level of toxicity that exists in a lot of our institutions here in South Africa, and I'm sure in other countries with a wounded context. And how do we bring this knowledge of trauma to say that let us transform these institutions so that they can really do the work that they needed to be able to do? I'm sure we can go on and on, but I just wanted to really emphasize those parts.
Thank you very much, Nomfundo. And I really appreciate all our panelists almost coming full circle with, sharing ideas around how to overcome this neglect, or how to heal institutions, how to simplify the messages, and how to make use of translators in the work that we do. As Nomfundo said, we can discuss this for a long time to come, and maybe we should have schedule a separate webinar on that topic. But so for today, I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. And again, thank you very much to our panelists who participated. We learned a great deal, and we will be chewing on both the questions that came up today and on your presentations for time to come. So thank you very much, and please join us again next week for our final webinar of the year.
Thank you so much, Melika, and thank you for organizing this, Pumla, and all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Melika. Unison, Landi.
Thanks all. Talk soon.
Bye. Unison.
Bye.
Landi, Lydia, can you stay, please, just for other conversations? Thank you so much, Lou-Marié. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, my dear.